The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as Captain Sarah Mitchell walked briskly toward the main administrative building. Her uniform was perfectly pressed, her boots polished to mirror shine, and her bearing reflected years of dedicated service. At 32, she had already seen more combat zones than most soldiers twice her age, but today felt different. Today, she was returning from a classified mission that would change everything. As she approached the entrance, Sarah noticed a commotion near the parking area. A tall, imposing figure in a colonel's uniform was berating a young private who had apparently made some minor mistake with vehicle maintenance. The colonel's voice carried across the courtyard, harsh and condescending. "You call this inspection ready, soldier?" Colonel James Harrison's voice boomed. "I've seen better work from recruits on their first day. Maybe you belong back in civilian life where standards don't matter." Sarah winced at the unnecessary cruelty in the man's tone. She had seen this type of leadership before, leaders who confused fear with respect, who believed that humiliation was a tool of motivation. The young private stood at attention, his face red with embarrassment as other personnel gathered to witness his public shamming. "Sir, I can fix the issue immediately," the private responded, his voice barely steady. "Fix it? You shouldn't have made the mistake in the first place. This is exactly what's wrong with today's military: no attention to detail, no pride in work." Colonel Harrison's eyes scanned the gathering crowd, clearly enjoying the audience for his display of authority. Sarah felt her jaw tighten. She had worked under officers like Harrison before, and she knew the damage such leadership could inflict on morale and unit cohesion. However, she also understood military protocol. As a captain, she was significantly outranked by the colonel, and interfering would be highly irregular. But as she watched the scene unfold, something in her refused to simply walk away. The private was clearly competent. His work on the vehicle was actually quite good, with only a minor oversight that could be corrected in minutes. This wasn't about maintaining standards. This was about power and ego. "Excuse me, Colonel," Sarah said, stepping forward with measured confidence. "Perhaps I could assist the private with the final inspection checklist. I have some experience with this particular vehicle model." Colonel Harrison turned his attention to Sarah, his expression immediately shifting from annoyance to something approaching interest. His eyes took in her captain's insignia, her ribbon rack, and her overall appearance with the practiced assessment of a career military officer. "Captain," he paused, clearly reading her name tag, Mitchell. "I wasn't aware that captains were now in the habit of interfering with senior officers' corrective actions." The words were delivered with a smile, but Sarah could hear the steel beneath them. This was a test, a challenge to her authority and position. She had encountered this dynamic countless times throughout her career, senior officers who viewed any input from junior personnel as insubordination, regardless of the validity of the concern. "Not interfering, sir," Sarah replied evenly. "Simply offering assistance to ensure the job gets done efficiently and correctly." Harrison's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "How thoughtful of you, Captain. Tell me, what exactly qualifies you to assess vehicle maintenance standards? Your record shows you've spent most of your career in intelligence operations, not mechanical work." Sarah felt a flutter of surprise. Harrison had clearly done some quick research on her background, probably through the personnel database accessible on his phone. It was an impressive display of preparation, but also revealed something about the man's character. He was the type who needed to maintain informational advantage in every interaction. "You're correct about my intelligence background, sir," Sarah acknowledged. "However, operational requirements have given me extensive hands-on experience with various equipment types. Field conditions don't always allow for specialized maintenance personnel." "Field conditions," Harrison repeated, his tone suggesting amusement. "Yes, I imagine intelligence work involves quite a bit of time in the field, sitting behind desks, analyzing reports, coordinating with local assets. Very hands-on indeed." The condescension in his voice was unmistakable now. Several other officers had gathered to watch the exchange, creating an audience that Harrison clearly relished. Sarah realized that this had moved beyond a simple disagreement about maintenance standards. It had become a public challenge to her competence and experience. "Sir, if I may suggest we focus on the immediate task," Sarah said, maintaining her professional demeanor despite the growing tension. "Private Johnson's work is actually quite solid. The issue appears to be a minor calibration oversight that can be resolved quickly." Harrison's expression hardened. Captain Mitchell, I find your assessment of my judgment somewhat presumptuous. I've been evaluating military performance for over 20 years. I think I'm capable of determining whether work meets acceptable standards. The private, Johnson, stood frozen between them, clearly uncomfortable being the center of this escalating conflict. Sarah could see the anxiety in his young face and felt a surge of protective instinct. This was exactly the type of situation that could devastate a young soldier's confidence and career prospects. "Of course, sir," Sarah replied carefully. "I'm not questioning your judgment. I'm simply noting that the technical specifications appear to be met with only minor adjustments needed." "Minor adjustments," Harrison said slowly, savoring the words. "Captain, let me explain something about military standards. There are no minor issues when it comes to equipment that soldiers depend on for their lives. Every bolt, every connection, every calibration must be perfect. Anything less is unacceptable." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "You're absolutely right about the importance of standards, sir. Lives do depend on this equipment. That's why I believe Private Johnson's work, which meets technical specifications, should be recognized as competent while we address the calibration issue constructively." The exchange had drawn the attention of nearly 24 personnel now. Word was spreading through the base that Captain Mitchell was challenging Colonel Harrison's authority, creating exactly the type of spectacle that military leadership typically sought to avoid. Harrison seemed to recognize this as well, and Sarah could see him calculating his next move. He was clearly a man accustomed to deference from junior officers, and her polite but firm pushback was not fitting his expectations. "Captain Mitchell," he said finally, his voice taking on a formal tone that suggested official displeasure, "I think perhaps your intelligence background hasn't fully prepared you for the realities of line operations. In the real military, we maintain standards through discipline and accountability, not through participation trophies and gentle encouragement." The insult was delivered smoothly, wrapped in professional language but unmistakably dismissive. Sarah felt a flash of anger but kept her expression neutral. She had dealt with worse provocations in hostile territory. She could certainly handle a pompous colonel in friendly territory. "I appreciate your perspective, sir," she said evenly. "My experience has taught me that effective leadership often involves recognizing good work while addressing areas for improvement. Both approaches serve to maintain high standards." Harrison's laugh was sharp and humorless, spoken like someone who's never had to depend on equipment performance under fire. "Tell me, Captain, what's the most dangerous situation you've faced in your intelligence career?" A paper cut from classified documents. The gathering crowd stirred at the open mockery. Several officers exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the confrontation. Military courtesy demanded a certain level of professional respect between officers, regardless of rank differences, and Harrison was moving well beyond those boundaries. Sarah felt the weight of every eye upon her. This moment would define her reputation on this base, and possibly beyond. She could retreat, accept the humiliation, and maintain the peace. Or she could stand her ground and face whatever consequences came from challenging a senior officer's authority. "Sir," she said quietly, "I've been in situations where equipment failure meant capture or death for entire teams. I've worked with local mechanics in conditions where perfection wasn't possible, but functionality was essential. I've learned to distinguish between critical failures and minor adjustments." "How admirable," Harrison replied sarcastically. "And I suppose these experiences make you qualified to overrule my assessment of maintenance standards." The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah realized that Harrison was now committed to this path. He couldn't back down without losing face in front of the assembled personnel. But she also understood that she had reached a point where retreat would signal acceptance of his characterization of her service and competence. "No, sir," Sarah said firmly, "but they do qualify me to recognize competent work when I see it. Private Johnson has done good work here. The calibration issue is minor and easily corrected. Treating it as a fundamental failure does a disservice to his effort and competence." Harrison's face reddened slightly. "Captain, I'm beginning to question whether your judgment is suited for military service at all. Perhaps intelligence work has made you too comfortable with ambiguity and compromise. In combat operations, there is no room for good enough." The personal attack was now unmistakable. Several officers in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that this had moved far beyond professional disagreement into personal territory. Sarah felt the familiar calm that had served her well in dangerous situations, a clarity that came when stakes became real. "You're absolutely right about combat operations, sir," she said, her voice carrying a quiet authority that seemed to cut through the tension. "There's no room for error when lives are at stake. That's why accurate assessment of capabilities and performance is so critical. Undermining competent personnel serves no one's interests." The standoff stretched for several long seconds. Harrison clearly hadn't expected such sustained resistance from a junior officer, especially in such a public forum. Sarah could see him processing options, trying to find a way to reassert his authority without escalating further. Finally, he stepped back slightly, his expression shifting to cold formality. "Captain Mitchell, I think this conversation has revealed significant differences in our understanding of military standards and leadership. Perhaps we should continue this discussion in a more appropriate setting." It was a face-saving retreat, wrapped in the language of military protocol. Sarah recognized the offer for what it was, an opportunity for both of them to step back from the brink of a formal confrontation that could have serious consequences for both their careers. "Of course, sir," Sarah replied respectfully. "I'm available at your convenience." Harrison nodded curtly, then turned his attention back to Private Johnson. "Private, you have 30 minutes to complete the corrections we've discussed. Report to my office when finished." As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah caught Johnson's eye and gave him a small, encouraging nod. The young soldier looked relieved but still anxious about the outcome of his encounter with the colonel. Walking away from the scene, Sarah reflected on what had just occurred. She had successfully defended a competent soldier from unfair criticism, but she had also made an enemy of a senior officer. In the complex politics of military life, such confrontations rarely ended with the initial exchange. As she continued toward the administrative building for her original appointment, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter with Colonel Harrison was just the beginning of a much larger conflict. She had no way of knowing how prescient that feeling would prove to be, or how dramatically the dynamic between them would shift once certain classified information became known. For now, she had accomplished her immediate goal, protecting a young soldier from unfair treatment. But she also understood that Colonel Harrison was not the type of man to forget a public challenge to his authority, and she would need to be prepared for whatever retaliation might come. The morning sun continued to climb higher, casting shorter shadows across the base, as Sarah prepared for whatever battles lay ahead. 3 days after the confrontation in the courtyard, Sarah found herself facing the consequences of standing up to Colonel Harrison. What had begun as a defense of proper standards had evolved into something far more personal and dangerous for her career. The first sign of retaliation came through official channels. Sarah received a formal request to report to Colonel Harrison's office for what was described as a routine performance review. The timing was suspicious. Performance reviews were typically conducted by immediate supervisors, not by colonels from different departments who had no direct authority over intelligence operations. As she walked through the corridors leading to Harrison's office, Sarah noticed the subtle changes in how other personnel interacted with her. Some offered supportive nods and whispered words of encouragement, clearly appreciating her defense of Private Johnson. Others avoided eye contact entirely, unwilling to be associated with someone who had publicly challenged senior leadership. The dynamics reminded her of intelligence operations in hostile territory, the careful calculation of loyalties, the assessment of who could be trusted, and the recognition that alliances could shift quickly based on changing circumstances. Military bases, she realized, had their own complex political ecosystems that could be just as treacherous as foreign operations. Colonel Harrison's office reflected his personality perfectly. The walls were covered with commendations, photographs with various dignitaries, and military memorabilia that spoke of a long and distinguished career. The desk was positioned to create maximum psychological impact, with visitors forced to sit in lower chairs while Harrison maintained elevation and authority. "Captain Mitchell," Harrison began without preamble as Sarah entered and saluted. "Please have a seat. I've been reviewing your personnel file, and I must say it makes for interesting reading." Sarah maintained her composure as she sat down, recognizing this as the opening gambit in what would likely be a carefully orchestrated campaign to undermine her position. Harrison's tone was professional, but she could detect the underlying hostility that had been building since their public confrontation. "Thank you, sir," she replied evenly. "I'm happy to discuss any aspects of my service record that might be relevant." Harrison opened a thick folder on his desk, making a show of reviewing documents that he had clearly already studied extensively. "Your record shows considerable time in classified operations, which is certainly impressive. However, I notice some gaps that raise questions about your overall suitability for continued service in sensitive positions." The accusation was vague, but ominous. Sarah understood that Harrison was probing for vulnerabilities, looking for ways to create doubt about her competence and reliability. The classified nature of much of her work made it difficult for her to provide detailed defenses without violating security protocols. "Could you be more specific about your concerns, sir?" Sarah asked, maintaining professional courtesy while refusing to be intimidated by general accusations. "Well, for example," Harrison continued, consulting his papers, "there's a 6-month period last year where your location and activities are completely redacted. That level of classification suggests either highly sensitive work or significant problems that required cover-up." Sarah felt a chill of recognition. Harrison was referring to her most recent deployment, the one she had just returned from days earlier. The classification level was indeed extraordinary, but for reasons that had nothing to do with covering up problems. In fact, the mission had been so successful that the results were still being processed at the highest levels of military command. "Sir, I'm not at liberty to discuss classified operations without proper authorization and clearance levels," Sarah responded carefully. "However, I can assure you that all my activities have been conducted within full compliance of military regulations and have received appropriate approvals from competent authority." Harrison's smile was cold and calculating. Of course, the classification excuse, very convenient when one wants to avoid accountability. "Tell me, Captain, how do we know that your classified work has been successful? How do we evaluate performance when everything is hidden behind security clearances?" The question revealed Harrison's fundamental misunderstanding of intelligence operations, but it also showed his strategy. He was attempting to use the classified nature of her work against her, suggesting that secrecy was being used to hide incompetence rather than protect national security. "Sir, my performance evaluations from authorized supervisors have consistently been excellent," Sarah replied. "The classification protocols exist to protect operational security and personnel safety, not to avoid accountability." "Authorized supervisors," Harrison repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, I see several positive evaluations here, but they're all from intelligence officers, people within your own community. It's natural for people to protect their own, isn't it?" The implication was clear. Harrison was suggesting that positive evaluations from intelligence supervisors were somehow less valid than assessments from conventional military officers like himself. It was a common prejudice within the military, where some traditional combat arms officers viewed intelligence personnel with suspicion. "Sir, intelligence operations are evaluated by personnel with appropriate expertise and clearance levels," Sarah explained patiently. "Just as medical officers evaluate medical personnel and engineers evaluate engineering work." "But ultimately, we're all soldiers first," Harrison countered. "And soldiers are judged by their ability to perform under pressure, to maintain standards, and to follow orders without question. Your behavior the other day suggests some deficiencies in these fundamental areas." Here was the real issue. Harrison was using the maintenance incident as evidence of broader character flaws, building a case that Sarah was fundamentally unsuited for military service. It was a sophisticated attack that used legitimate concerns about military discipline to mask personal vendetta. "Colonel, I believe my actions demonstrated commitment to maintaining proper standards and protecting the morale of competent personnel," Sarah responded firmly. "Supporting good work while addressing legitimate concerns is fundamental leadership." Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying her with the intensity of a predator evaluating prey. "Captain, let me be very clear about something. The military is not a democracy. Junior officers do not get to second-guess senior officers' decisions, particularly not in public forums. Your behavior violated basic principles of military hierarchy and discipline." "With respect, sir, Military officers at all levels have an obligation to ensure that standards are maintained fairly and accurately, Sarah replied. Protecting competent personnel from unfair criticism serves the interests of the organization and mission accomplishment. Unfair criticism. Harrison's voice rose slightly, showing the first crack in his controlled demeanor. Captain, are you suggesting that my assessment of maintenance standards was incorrect? Sarah recognized the trap. Harrison was trying to force her into a direct challenge to his judgment, which could then be characterized as insubordination. She needed to navigate carefully between standing by her principles and avoiding grounds for formal disciplinary action. Sir, I'm suggesting that different perspectives on the same situation can sometimes lead to different conclusions, she said diplomatically. My assessment was that Private Johnson's work met technical specifications with minor adjustments needed. Your assessment, Harrison said slowly. Based on what expertise, what specific qualifications do you have to evaluate mechanical maintenance work? Sarah had been waiting for this question. Sir, my deployments have required extensive knowledge of various equipment types, including maintenance and repair capabilities under field conditions. Additionally, I hold several technical certifications that qualify me to evaluate equipment readiness. She could see Harrison's confidence waver slightly. He had assumed that her intelligence background meant purely analytical work, but the reality of modern intelligence operations required much more diverse skill sets than traditional military officers often understood. Technical certifications, Harrison said, consulting his folder again. I don't see any mention of mechanical certifications in your official record. Many of my certifications are held under classified programs, sir, Sarah explained. The training is provided by specialized schools that don't appear on standard personnel records due to operational security requirements. This was completely accurate, but Sarah could see that Harrison viewed it as another convenient excuse hidden behind classification barriers. His frustration was becoming more apparent as his assumptions about her background proved increasingly inaccurate. Captain Mitchell, Harrison said finally, I'm going to be very direct with you. Your attitude and behavior concern me greatly. Military effectiveness depends on clear chains of command and respect for authority. Officers who undermine those principles, regardless of their technical qualifications, represent a threat to unit cohesion and mission success. The threat was now explicit. Harrison was building a case for removing her from her position, using the maintenance incident as evidence of fundamental unsuitability for military service. Sarah realized she needed to address this directly while being careful not to escalate the conflict further. Sir, I understand your concerns about chain of command and military discipline, she said respectfully. However, I believe effective military service also requires officers to exercise judgment and speak up when they observe issues that could impact mission accomplishment or personnel welfare. And you believe you observed such issues during the maintenance incident? Harrison asked. I observed a competent soldier being criticized for work that met technical standards, Sarah replied honestly. I believed that intervening to clarify the technical situation would serve the interests of accurate assessment and personnel morale. Harrison was quiet for several long moments, clearly considering his next approach. Sarah could see him weighing options, how far to push this confrontation, what formal actions might be justified, and how to achieve his goal of neutralizing what he saw as a threat to his authority. Captain, I want you to understand something very clearly, he said finally. Military service requires absolute respect for rank and position. Officers who cannot demonstrate that respect, who consistently question the judgment of senior personnel, do not belong in positions of responsibility. I understand the importance of military hierarchy, sir, Sarah responded. I also understand that effective military service sometimes requires difficult conversations about standards and performance. Difficult conversations, Harrison repeated with obvious disdain. Is that what you call publicly contradicting a senior officer's assessment? Sir, I call it ensuring that competent personnel receive fair evaluation, Sarah said firmly. The exchange had reached an impasse. Harrison clearly wanted her to admit wrongdoing and promise to avoid future challenges to his authority. Sarah was equally determined to maintain her position that defending proper standards and personnel welfare was appropriate military conduct. Captain Mitchell, Harrison said with finality, I'm going to make a recommendation to your supervisors that you receive additional training in military courtesy and chain of command protocols. Furthermore, I'll be watching your future performance very carefully for any additional signs of inappropriate behavior. It was a formal warning disguised as developmental planning. Sarah understood that Harrison was creating a paper trail that could be used to justify future disciplinary actions or negative evaluations that might impact her career progression. "I appreciate your interest in my professional development, sir," Sarah replied politely. "I'm always open to training that enhances my effectiveness as a military officer." Harrison's expression suggested he had expected more resistance or submission, not this calm acceptance of his implied threats. Sarah's composure seemed to frustrate him more than defiance might have. "Very well," he said curtly. "You're dismissed, Captain. I trust our conversation has clarified expectations for future conduct." "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, rising and saluting before turning to leave. As she walked back through the corridors, Sarah reflected on the encounter. Harrison had revealed his strategy clearly. He intended to use her classified background against her, characterizing secrecy as evidence of questionable performance. He would build a case for unsuitability based on the maintenance incident and any future conflicts he could provoke or manufacture. What Harrison didn't understand, however, was that Sarah's most recent deployment had resulted in achievements that would soon become known to senior military leadership. The classification that he was using as a weapon against her was actually protecting information that would completely change the dynamic between them. For now, though, she had to navigate the immediate threat to her career and reputation. Harrison had made it clear that he considered her an enemy, and she would need to be prepared for whatever escalation might come next. The battle lines had been drawn, and the conflict was far from over. Over the following 2 weeks, Colonel Harrison's campaign against Sarah intensified with calculated precision. What had begun as a personal conflict over maintenance standards evolved into a systematic effort to undermine her reputation, credibility, and career prospects throughout the base. The attacks came in multiple forms, each carefully designed to appear legitimate while serving Harrison's broader objective of forcing Sarah's removal or resignation. The first wave involved questioning her professional competence in ways that seemed reasonable on the surface, but created doubt about her qualifications among personnel who didn't know her work history. During a staff meeting that Sarah attended as a liaison for intelligence operations, Harrison made a point of questioning every recommendation she offered. When she provided analysis about regional security threats, he demanded sources and methodology with an intensity that implied her assessments were unreliable. When she suggested operational improvements based on field experience, he asked pointed questions about her qualifications to evaluate military operations. "Captain Mitchell," Harrison said during one such exchange, "your analysis suggests that current patrol routes are inefficient. On what basis do you make this assessment? Do you have experience planning and executing patrol operations?" The question was designed to highlight the gap between Sarah's intelligence background and traditional combat operations. While she had extensive field experience, it was primarily in reconnaissance and analysis rather than conventional patrolling, and Harrison was exploiting this distinction to undermine her credibility. "Sir, my assessment is based on analysis of incident reports, efficiency metrics, and observations from personnel conducting the patrols," Sarah responded professionally. "The data suggests opportunities for optimization that could improve both security coverage and resource utilization." "Data analysis," Harrison said with subtle mockery. "Of course. Tell me, Captain, have you ever actually led a patrol in hostile territory? Have you experienced the reality of making real-time tactical decisions under fire?" The challenge was unfair but effective. Most of the officers in the meeting were from combat arms backgrounds, and Harrison was appealing to their natural skepticism about intelligence officers who offered operational advice without direct command experience. Sarah could see several officers nodding slightly, accepting Harrison's implied criticism. "No, sir, I haven't led conventional patrols," Sarah admitted honestly. "However, I have conducted independent operations in hostile territory that required similar risk assessment and tactical planning skills." "Independent operations," Harrison repeated thoughtfully. "Classified work, I assume. How convenient that we can't evaluate the relevance or success of these mysterious activities." The attack was becoming familiar. Harrison consistently used the classified nature of Sarah's work to suggest that claims about her experience and competence couldn't be. It was an effective strategy because intelligence operations were inherently secretive, making it impossible for her to provide specific examples or evidence of her capabilities. Beyond the direct confrontations, Harrison also worked to isolate Sarah socially and professionally within the base community. He made subtle comments to other officers about concerns regarding intelligence personnel who didn't understand military culture. He questioned whether officers with extensive classified assignments could be fully trusted with conventional military responsibilities. These whisper campaigns were particularly damaging because they played on existing tensions between different military specialties. Combat arms officers sometimes viewed intelligence personnel with suspicion, wondering whether analysts truly understood the realities of combat operations. Harrison skillfully exploited these prejudices to create doubt about Sarah's legitimacy as a military officer. The social isolation was perhaps more painful than the professional attacks. Sarah found herself excluded from informal gatherings where officers typically built relationships and shared information. Invitations to meals or social events became rare. Casual conversations in hallways grew shorter and more formal. Private Johnson, whose defense had started this entire conflict, approached Sarah one evening as she was leaving the administrative building. The young soldier looked nervous but determined to speak with her. "Captain Mitchell," he said quietly, "I wanted to thank you for standing up for me the other day. I know it's caused problems for you, and I'm sorry about that." Sarah smiled at the earnest young man. "Johnson, you did good work, and someone needed to acknowledge that. Don't apologize for others' reactions." "Ma'am, some of the guys are saying that Colonel Harrison is trying to get you transferred out because of what happened. Is that true?" The question revealed how widely the conflict had become known throughout the enlisted ranks. Military gossip networks were efficient information systems, and news of tensions between officers spread quickly among personnel who were always interested in leadership dynamics. "Johnson, officers sometimes have professional disagreements," Sarah replied diplomatically. "What matters is that you continue doing excellent work and maintaining the standards you've demonstrated." But privately, Sarah knew that Johnson's concerns were well-founded. Harrison's campaign was intensifying, and she could see the cumulative effect on her position within the base hierarchy. Other officers were becoming reluctant to associate with her, unwilling to risk Harrison's displeasure by appearing supportive of someone he had targeted. The situation reached a new level of seriousness when Harrison began questioning Sarah's security clearance and access to classified information. During a meeting with base security personnel, he raised concerns about intelligence officers who had spent extensive time in overseas deployments without proper oversight. "I'm not suggesting any wrongdoing," Harrison told the security officer in Sarah's presence, "but extended periods in classified assignments create opportunities for compromise that require careful evaluation. We have protocols for periodic review of clearance holders, particularly those with extensive foreign exposure." The implication was devastating. Harrison was suggesting that Sarah's overseas intelligence work might have compromised her loyalty or reliability. Security reviews were serious processes that could result in clearance suspension and immediate removal from sensitive positions. Sarah felt a surge of anger at the suggestion, but she also recognized the tactical brilliance of Harrison's approach. By questioning her clearance status, he was attacking the foundation of her entire career. Intelligence officers without clearances were effectively unemployable in their specialty. "Colonel Harrison," Sarah said carefully, "my clearance status has been reviewed and renewed regularly according to established protocols. All required investigations and polygraph examinations have been completed successfully." "I'm sure they have," Harrison replied smoothly. "But given recent concerns about your judgment and attitude toward authority, perhaps an additional review would be prudent. We can't be too careful about security matters." The security officer, caught between a senior colonel's request and standard procedures, looked uncomfortable but nodded agreement. "I'll check on the timeline for Captain Mitchell's last review and determine if an early renewal is warranted." Sarah understood that an early security review could effectively end her career, even if she was ultimately cleared. The process could take months, during which her access would be suspended, and her ability to perform intelligence work eliminated. Even successful completion would leave questions about why the review had been necessary. That evening, Sarah sat in her quarters reflecting on how quickly her situation had deteriorated. 2 weeks earlier, she had been a respected intelligence officer with an exemplary record. Now she faced professional isolation, questions about her competence, and potential loss of her security clearance. The irony was that her most recent deployment had been extraordinarily successful. The classified operation she had just completed had resulted in intelligence breakthroughs that were being briefed at the highest levels of military and civilian leadership. But the classification requirements that protected this success were also being used as weapons against her. Sarah considered her options carefully. She could attempt to fight Harrison's campaign through official channels, filing complaints about harassment and inappropriate conduct. However, such actions were risky for junior officers challenging senior personnel, particularly when the senior officer was skilled at maintaining plausible deniability for his actions. Alternatively, she could seek transfer to another assignment, removing herself from Harrison's direct influence. This approach would protect her career in the short term, but would also represent a victory for Harrison and set a precedent for future targeting of officers who challenged his authority. The third option was to endure the current situation while waiting for circumstances to change. This approach required considerable personal strength and faith that truth would eventually prevail, but it also risked permanent damage to her reputation and career prospects. As Sarah weighed these possibilities, she received an unexpected phone call from her former supervisor in intelligence operations. Colonel Stone was calling from Pentagon headquarters with news that would change everything. "Sarah," Colonel Stone said, "I need you to prepare for a trip to Washington. There are people who want to discuss your recent deployment in detail. I can't say much over an unsecured line, but your work has gotten attention at very high levels." The call lasted only a few minutes, but it provided the first indication that Sarah's current troubles might be temporary. The success of her classified mission was beginning to generate recognition that would soon become public within appropriate channels. However, she also realized that Harrison's campaign against her was likely to intensify before circumstances changed. Senior officers who had committed to a particular course of action rarely backed down easily, and Harrison had invested considerable effort in undermining her position. The next few days would be critical. Sarah needed to survive Harrison's escalating attacks while maintaining her professional integrity and avoiding actions that could be used against her. It would require all the skills she had learned in intelligence operations: patience, careful analysis, and strategic thinking. As she prepared for sleep that night, Sarah reflected on the complex dynamics of military life. The same institution that had given her opportunities for meaningful service and professional growth also contained individuals who used their authority for personal vendettas. The challenge was navigating these realities while maintaining commitment to the values that had drawn her to military service initially. Tomorrow would bring new challenges from Harrison's campaign, but it would also bring her closer to the moment when the truth about her recent accomplishments would become known. The question was whether she could endure until that revelation changed the dynamic entirely. The call from Washington came on a Tuesday morning, just as Colonel Harrison was preparing what he believed would be his final assault on Sarah's career. He had scheduled a meeting with the base commander to present his accumulated evidence of her unsuitability for continued service, confident that his systematic campaign had created sufficient doubt about her competence and reliability. Sarah was in her office reviewing intelligence reports when her secure phone rang. The voice on the other end belonged to General Hawkins, one of the highest-ranking intelligence officers in the military hierarchy. "Captain Mitchell," the general said, "you need to be on a flight to Air Force Base this afternoon. There's a car waiting outside your building right now. Bring your dress uniform and plan to be away for at least 3 days." The urgency in the general's tone was unmistakable, and Sarah understood that something significant was developing. High-ranking generals didn't personally arrange transportation for captains unless the matter was of exceptional importance. "Yes, ma'am," Sarah replied. "May I ask what this concerns?" "Your recent deployment has generated considerable interest among senior leadership," General Hawkins explained carefully. "The details will be briefed when you arrive, but I can tell you that your work has exceeded all expectations and requirements." As Sarah gathered her materials and prepared to leave, she had no way of knowing that Colonel Harrison was, at that very moment, sitting in the base commander's office presenting his case for her removal from service. "Sir," Harrison was saying to Colonel David, the base commander, "Captain Mitchell represents a significant risk to unit cohesion and military discipline. Her behavior demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of military hierarchy and proper conduct." Colonel, a thoughtful officer with extensive combat experience, listened carefully to Harrison's presentation. The accumulated evidence seemed concerning: public challenges to authority, questions about classified work that couldn't be, and general attitude problems that suggested poor fit with military culture. "These are serious allegations, James," said finally. "Have you discussed these concerns directly with Captain Mitchell? Has she had an opportunity to respond to your assessment?" "I've attempted to counsel her, sir," Harrison replied. "But she continues to demonstrate the same problematic attitudes. She seems to believe that her intelligence background exempts her from normal military courtesy and discipline standards." Harrison had carefully constructed his case to appear reasonable and professional. Each incident was presented as part of a pattern of problematic behavior, building toward a conclusion that Sarah was fundamentally unsuited for military service. The presentation was convincing because it was based on actual events, even though the interpretation was biased and incomplete. "What specific action are you recommending?" asked. "Sir, I believe Captain Mitchell should be transferred immediately to a position with minimal leadership responsibility, while a comprehensive review of her service record is conducted," Harrison replied. "If that review confirms the pattern of problems I've documented, I would recommend separation from service." Meanwhile, Sarah was boarding a military aircraft bound for Washington, unaware that her career was being debated in the base commander's office. The flight gave her time to reflect on recent events and wonder what her former supervisor had meant about exceeding expectations and requirements. The classified mission she had just completed had been extraordinarily challenging. Working with minimal support in a hostile environment, she had successfully penetrated a terrorist network that had been operating undetected for years. The intelligence she had gathered had led to the prevention of multiple planned attacks and the capture of key personnel who had been high-priority targets for international security services. But the most significant aspect of her work had been the development of new intelligence-gathering techniques that could be applied to similar situations worldwide. Her innovations had impressed her supervisors so much that they had been briefed to the highest levels of government, including civilian leadership and senior military commanders. As her aircraft approached Washington, Sarah still had no idea that this success would soon transform her situation completely. She was focused on whatever briefings awaited her, unaware that Colonel Harrison's campaign against her was about to encounter an insurmountable obstacle. Back at the base, Colonel was concluding his meeting with Harrison when his aide knocked on the door. "Sir," the aide said, "I have an urgent call for you from the Pentagon. It's General Martinez from the Joint Chiefs of Staff Office." Took the call while Harrison waited, curious about what could be so urgent that a three-star general would call directly. The conversation was brief but clearly significant, based on changing expression and increasingly respectful tone. "Yes, sir," said finally. "I understand completely. We'll ensure that all appropriate protocols are followed immediately." When he hung up the phone, turned to Harrison with an expression that had shifted dramatically from their earlier conversation. "James," he said carefully, "I need to ask you about Captain Mitchell's recent performance evaluations and any disciplinary actions you may have initiated or recommended." Harrison felt a flutter of uncertainty. The timing of the call and change in demeanor suggested that something had altered the context of their discussion. "Sir, as I've explained, my concerns about Captain Mitchell are documented and based on observed behavior," Harrison replied cautiously. "I've made no formal disciplinary recommendations yet, but I believe her conduct warrants serious review." Was quiet for a moment, clearly processing information from his phone call that Harrison wasn't privy to. When he spoke again, his tone was measured and formal. "James, I've just been informed that Captain Mitchell is currently in Washington briefing senior leadership on a highly classified operation that has been deemed extraordinarily successful," said slowly. "The operation has resulted in significant national security achievements that are being recognized at the highest levels of government." Harrison felt the blood drain from his face as the implications became clear. Everything he had said about Sarah's questionable performance and reliability was being contradicted by official recognition from the highest levels of military leadership. "Sir, I wasn't aware of any current operations involving Captain Mitchell," Harrison said weakly. "My concerns are based on her behavior here on base, not her classified work." "According to what I've just been told," continued, "Captain Mitchell's recent deployment involved extraordinary courage, innovation, and professional competence. Her work has exceeded all expectations and has been personally commended by senior civilian and military leaders." The irony was devastating. Harrison had spent weeks attacking Sarah's credibility by questioning her classified work, suggesting that secrecy was being used to hide incompetence. Now that same classified work was being revealed as extraordinarily successful and worthy of the highest recognition. "James," said finally, "I think we need to reconsider your assessment of Captain Mitchell's performance and suitability for service." In Washington, Sarah was experiencing the other side of this dramatic reversal. She had been escorted to a secure briefing room where several general officers and senior civilian officials were waiting to discuss her recent mission. General Hawkins made the introductions, explaining that Sarah's work had attracted attention throughout the intelligence community and senior military leadership. The operation she had completed had not only succeeded in its immediate objectives, but had also demonstrated innovative approaches that would influence future operations. "Captain Mitchell," said General Robert Martinez, "your recent work represents exactly the type of initiative and competence that our military needs. The techniques you developed and the results you achieved have impressed everyone who has reviewed your reports." Sarah listened in amazement as senior leaders described the impact of her work. The intelligence she had gathered had prevented multiple terrorist attacks, led to the capture of high-value targets, and provided insights that were being used to develop new security protocols. But the most surprising revelation came when General Hawkins explained the recognition that would result from her achievements. "Captain Mitchell," the general said, "based on your extraordinary performance and the significance of your contributions, you're being recommended for immediate promotion to major and assignment to a senior position in strategic intelligence operations." The promotion was not only recognition of her recent work, but also a signal that senior leadership had complete confidence in her abilities and potential. It represented the type of career advancement that typically took years to achieve through normal progression. "Additionally," General Martinez added, "you're being recommended for the Distinguished Service Medal in recognition of your exceptional contribution to national security." Sarah felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of recognition being offered. The Distinguished Service Medal was one of the highest awards available to military personnel, typically reserved for achievements that significantly impact national security or military effectiveness. Back at the base, Colonel Harrison was struggling to process the complete reversal of his position. Not only had his campaign against Sarah been rendered pointless, but his own credibility was now seriously damaged by his misjudgment of her capabilities and value. "James," Colonel said quietly, "I need you to explain to me how someone who deserves the Distinguished Service Medal came to be characterized as unfit for military service." The question was devastating because it highlighted the fundamental error in Harrison's assessment. He had allowed personal animosity to blind him to Sarah's actual capabilities and achievements, leading him to mount a campaign against an officer who was actually performing at the highest levels. "Sir," Harrison said desperately, "my concerns were based on her behavior here on base, not her operational performance. She demonstrated disrespect for authority and poor judgment in dealing with senior officers." "Are you referring to the maintenance incident with Private Johnson?" asked. "Yes, sir, among other things," Harrison replied, grasping for justification for his actions. Consulted some notes on his desk, information that had apparently been provided during his conversation with General Martinez. "According to what I've been told," said, "Captain Mitchell's assessment of Private Johnson's work was completely accurate. The technical specifications were met, and only minor adjustments were needed. Her intervention protected a competent soldier from unfair criticism." The final piece of Harrison's case crumbled away. Even the incident that had started the entire conflict was being as evidence of Sarah's professional competence and leadership ability, rather than insubordination and disrespect. Harrison realized that he had not only failed in his campaign against Sarah, but had also seriously damaged his own reputation and credibility in the process. Senior leadership would now view him as an officer who had poor judgment about personnel and was willing to pursue personal vendettas against competent subordinates. As Sarah's briefings continued in Washington, she began to understand the full scope of how dramatically her situation had changed. The same achievements that Colonel Harrison had been unable to evaluate or acknowledge were now being recognized by the highest levels of military and civilian leadership. The irony was profound. Harrison's attacks on her classified work had been based on the assumption that secrecy was hiding incompetence. In reality, that secrecy had been protecting information about extraordinary success and achievement. Within hours, news of Sarah's recognition would reach her base, completely transforming the dynamic that Harrison had worked so carefully to establish. The officer he had characterized as unsuitable for military service would be revealed as one of the most accomplished and valued personnel in the intelligence community. The transformation of Sarah's situation became public knowledge when she returned to the base 3 days later. The same corridors where she had faced whispers and isolation now buzzed with news of her promotion to major and the Distinguished Service Medal recommendation. Officers who had previously avoided her now sought opportunities to congratulate her and express their support. But the most dramatic moment came when Sarah encountered Colonel Harrison in the same courtyard where their conflict had begun. This time, however, the dynamic between them had been completely reversed by revelations that neither had anticipated during their initial confrontation. Harrison was standing near the administrative building when Sarah approached, wearing the oak leaves of her new rank and carrying the confidence that came from official recognition of her achievements. The contrast with her situation just days earlier was so stark that several personnel gathered to observe the encounter, sensing that something significant was about to occur. "Major Mitchell," Harrison said formally, his voice carrying none of the condescension that had characterized their previous interactions. "Congratulations on your promotion." The title itself was jarring to Harrison. Sarah was now a field-grade officer, closer to his own rank, and possessed of authority and credibility that made his previous attacks seem not only inappropriate but professionally damaging to his own reputation. "Thank you, Colonel," Sarah replied evenly, maintaining the same professional composure she had shown throughout their conflict. Harrison struggled with the situation he found himself in. His systematic campaign to destroy Sarah's career had not only failed completely, but had revealed his own fundamental misjudgment of her capabilities and value to the military. Senior leadership now viewed him as an officer who had demonstrated poor judgment about personnel and had been willing to pursue personal vendettas against highly competent subordinates. "I understand your recent deployment was quite successful," Harrison said, attempting to find some way to salvage the interaction. "It achieved its objectives," Sarah replied diplomatically, though both of them understood that this was considerable understatement. Her mission had been recognized as extraordinary by the highest levels of military and civilian leadership. The gathering crowd of personnel created additional pressure for Harrison. Many of them had witnessed his public humiliation of Private Johnson and his subsequent campaign against Sarah. Now they were seeing the complete vindication of her competence and the implicit criticism of his judgment. Private Johnson himself was among the observers, watching with obvious satisfaction as the officer who had defended him received recognition while the colonel who had unfairly criticized his work faced public embarrassment. "Major Mitchell," Harrison continued, clearly struggling to find appropriate words, "I hope you understand that my previous concerns were based on observations of base conduct, not questions about your operational capabilities." The distinction was meaningless, and both of them knew it. Military leadership was evaluated holistically. Officers couldn't be considered competent in operations while being fundamentally unsuitable for garrison duties. Harrison's campaign had been based on the premise that Sarah was unsuitable for military service generally, not just for specific assignments. "Of course, Colonel," Sarah replied graciously, though her tone carried an undertone that suggested she understood exactly how hollow his explanation was. Colonel, the base commander, approached the group and provided additional context that made Harrison's situation even more uncomfortable. "Major Mitchell," said warmly, I wanted to personally congratulate you on your achievements and assure you that this base takes great pride in your accomplishments. The base commander's public support was significant because it represented official endorsement of Sarah's character and capabilities. It also served as implicit criticism of anyone who had questioned her suitability for service. "Thank you, sir," Sarah replied. "I'm grateful for the support I've received here." His next comments were directed at the broader group, but clearly intended for Harrison's benefit. Major Mitchell's success demonstrates the importance of recognizing and supporting exceptional talent, said. Military effectiveness depends on our ability to identify and develop officers who can achieve extraordinary results under challenging conditions. The message was unmistakable. Harrison's failure to recognize Sarah's capabilities reflected poorly on his judgment as a senior officer. His campaign against her had been not only inappropriate, but also counterproductive to military effectiveness. As the group began to disperse, Harrison found himself in the humiliating position of having to address Sarah privately. The reversal of their positions was so complete that he needed to consider the potential impact on his own career of their continued conflict. "Major Mitchell," he said quietly, "I hope we can move forward professionally despite our previous disagreements." Sarah recognized this as an attempt to minimize the significance of what had occurred between them. Harrison was hoping to characterize their conflict as a simple disagreement between professionals, rather than acknowledge that he had mounted a systematic campaign to destroy her career based on fundamental misjudgment of her capabilities. "Colonel Harrison," Sarah replied thoughtfully, "I believe professional disagreements are natural in any organization. What matters is that we maintain focus on mission accomplishment and taking care of our people." Her response was masterful because it acknowledged his attempt at reconciliation while maintaining emphasis on the principles that had guided her actions throughout their conflict. She was reminding him that her defense of Private Johnson and her resistance to his attacks had been motivated by professional duty rather than personal animosity. But Sarah also understood that Harrison's career had been seriously damaged by this episode. Senior leadership would remember his poor judgment about personnel and his willingness to pursue personal vendettas against competent officers. Such characteristics were not valued in leaders at any level of military hierarchy. Over the following weeks, the consequences of the reversal became apparent in multiple ways. Sarah's promotion brought new responsibilities and opportunities for advancement that positioned her for continued success in intelligence operations. Her recognition also attracted positive attention from senior leaders who were interested in her innovative approaches and proven capabilities. Harrison, meanwhile, found himself increasingly isolated within the senior officer community. Word of his misjudgment regarding Sarah had spread through military networks, creating questions about his competence in evaluating personnel and his suitability for positions requiring sound judgment about people. The irony of the situation was not lost on either of them. Harrison had attempted to use Sarah's classified background against her, suggesting that secrecy was hiding incompetence or questionable conduct. In reality, that classified work had produced extraordinary achievements that earned recognition at the highest levels of government. The maintenance incident that had started their conflict was now seen in completely different light. Sarah's defense of Private Johnson was viewed as evidence of her leadership capability and commitment to fair treatment of competent personnel. Harrison's criticism of the soldier was seen as indicative of poor judgment about technical standards and unnecessary harshness toward subordinates. 6 months after their initial confrontation, Sarah received orders assigning her to a senior position at Pentagon headquarters, where she would help develop new intelligence capabilities based on her innovative fieldwork. The assignment represented extraordinary career advancement and positioned her for continued growth in strategic leadership roles. Harrison, by contrast, found his career progression stalled. His fitness reports reflected concerns about his judgment regarding personnel, and senior officers were reluctant to recommend him for positions requiring evaluation and development of subordinates. The complete reversal of their positions served as a powerful lesson about the dangers of making judgments based on prejudice rather than actual performance. Harrison's assumptions about intelligence officers and his failure to recognize exceptional competence when he encountered it had led to professional humiliation and career damage that would follow him for years. For Sarah, the experience reinforced the importance of maintaining professional integrity, even in the face of unfair treatment. Her decision to defend proper standards and competent personnel had been vindicated completely, demonstrating that principles-based leadership ultimately prevailed over political maneuvering and personal attacks. As she prepared to leave for her new assignment in Washington, Sarah reflected on the lessons learned from her conflict with Harrison. Military service involved complex human dynamics where personal prejudices could override professional judgment, but it also provided mechanisms for recognizing and rewarding genuine achievement. The young Private Johnson, whose defense had started the entire episode, approached Sarah on her final day at the base. "Major Mitchell," he said, "I wanted to thank you again for standing up for me. I heard about everything that happened afterward, and I'm grateful that someone was willing to do what was right." "Johnson," Sarah replied, "you did excellent work and that was worth defending. Keep maintaining those standards and you'll have a successful career." As Sarah drove away from the base for the last time, she considered how dramatically circumstances could change when truth finally emerged from behind classification barriers. The same secrecy that Harrison had used as a weapon against her had ultimately protected the information that completely vindicated her competence and character. The experience had taught both of them important lessons about the nature of military service, the importance of accurate judgment about people, and the ultimate triumph of genuine achievement over political maneuvering. For Sarah, it was validation of her commitment to professional excellence and ethical leadership. For Harrison, it was a painful reminder that personal prejudices could lead to professional disaster when they overrode sound judgment about people and performance.